Now, let's pick up on a story that actually broke yesterday, but really there's still so much to unpack. The Reserve Bank announced yesterday that it was unable to find any violations of exchange controls related to the theft of money purportedly paid for the sale of animals on the President's Game Farm in February 2020. That money, hidden in a sofa on the property, was later stolen. The former spy boss, Arthur Fraser, claimed last year he had evidence the president had ordered the thieves to be pursued privately and the matter to be covered up. And he laid charges, which of course opened up a host of separate investigations. A tax probe by SARS concluded in March this year that a $4 million sale of game on the farm in 2020 was in fact declared. So both SARS and the Reserve Bank seem to agree that in their specific areas of focus, there's no evidence of wrongdoing. The Hawks, of course, are yet to complete their probe into the matter. That's a key investigation. But in the meantime, let's take a closer look at the tax and exchange control aspect of this. And I'm joined by Dr. Albertus Marais. He's an international tax expert and founder of AJM Tax Consultancy. Dr. Marais, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm relying on you to unpack this in an easy to understand way, because of course these issues can become quite complicated, and it's not helped by the quite convoluted explanation we received from the Reserve Bank yesterday. So let's start with that, the Reserve Bank findings. And I think the key phrase is that they found there was, and I'm quoting, no perfected transaction. And on that basis, they found no exchange control violations. What does no perfected transaction actually mean?
Sally, good evening. So the fact is that the Reserve Bank effectively says that there was no transaction concluded. So the sales agreement, or the sale of the buffalo, was never finalized. They were concluded finally, that the suspensive conditions that it was subject to wasn't fulfilled, and therefore that Mr. Ramaphosa was not entitled to receive the dollars. In fact, therefore, he received it almost as a deposit of sorts, and therefore, by virtue of not being entitled to the amounts yet, he was under no obligation to report that receipt to the Reserve Bank and, of course, to offer the dollars for purchase by the Reserve Bank. So that is from the exchange control perspective what the Reserve Bank found. This seems to differ, and confusingly so, from what SARS has found, in that it says that they are happy that the transaction was correctly reported and disclosed for tax purposes. Of course, you can see the contradistinction there is that the Reserve Bank says that no transaction, whereas SARS says, yes, a transaction which was disclosed.
Mm. So how do you make sense of it? Because I don't understand that either.
Yeah, Sally, I have respect for your view because I don't understand it either, to be honest. The fact is there can either be a transaction or there cannot be one. So either this transaction was in legalese perfected or it wasn't. If it was perfected, then Mr. Ramaphosa was entitled to receive the amounts, meaning that he should have declared it, and meaning that tax consequences would have come about, which were declared. If it wasn't perfected, then no tax consequences could have come about. In our law, in our country, we tax amounts subject to VAT, capital gains tax, and income tax if you have a transaction that has been concluded. So it can either be the one or the other, but it can certainly not be both.
Also, they said yesterday, the Reserve Bank, that they couldn't make full details of their probe public. Do you understand their reasoning? Just to talk us through the reasoning and whether you agree with their reasoning.
So, again, and it is unfortunately, I think, a theme that's being picked up on nowadays is this secrecy that public representatives and government seeks to potentially, well, it seems at least creates that impression, to hide things away. We had it with Mr. Zuma's tax returns. Of course, that matter that's ongoing as a constitutional dispute. We had the Lady R report that was, of course, also confidential. And now we have this matter. One can understand and sympathize that Mr. Ramaphosa's financial affairs may be kept secret in terms of prevailing legislation. But I'm of the view that this doesn't favor the public nor Mr. Ramaphosa. It paints everyone in a bad light. We are not taken into the confidence of the Reserve Bank to understand what their reasoning is exactly in arriving at this conclusion. how it adds up with SARS's conclusions on the matter, nor to understand really still what actually happened. So yes, there is legislation, of course, like for tax legislation, that protects taxpayer and persons' financial information. That is so. But I think given what we have here and the Reserve Bank's acknowledgement in this very terse media statement of theirs, to say that in the interest of the public, they are disclosing the outcome of the investigation, I think that's not enough. I think for everyone's sake, we should be taken into the confidence of the regulator, of the Reserve Bank, and be made to understand exactly how these conclusions are all reached and how they add up.
So as an expert in tax and exchange controls, what are the unanswered questions still for you in this issue?
Now, the unanswered questions to me still is what this arrangement involved of Mr. Ramaphosa. The second real question to me is, why did we have such a significant transaction being concluded in cash? I can tell you from my experience is that cash transactions are being concluded because they do not have a paper trail. That is why it is prevalent in fraudulent activities. It's because it can be hidden away. Now, I'm not saying that we have fraud here at all, but what I'm saying is that there is that suspicion by the public that something untoward happened here. And if we're not taken into the confidence of the government, that speculation will remain. And that specific question of why we had such a significant cash transaction, quite apparently being hidden away, that is to me the main question that remains to be answered.
Is it clear at this point how the money actually got into the country? Because that's something that either I've missed or I'm not sure of.
That's also not clear. Whether we have money stuffed away in suitcases or shoes or being brought in by whatever means, I can promise you it's certainly not been drawn from an ATM in town. So that money must have crossed the border somewhere. And the suspicion must be that that money was also not reported. So the problem is that we still have quite a bit of non-disclosure, things that are not transparent in this case, and that I'm concerned will ultimately lead to the public confidence diminishing in our public institutions. Sally, to be frank, I think that this seems like almost, or gives the impression of this being a cover-up, of looking for an excuse to not find Mr. Ramaphosa having breached the regulations applicable to exchange control. And that impression will remain as long as these unanswered questions linger. It is no coincidence that we refer to an open and democratic society that we want South Africa to be. It's because openness is inherently linked to democracy. And if we're not going to be open about the facts here, I'm afraid that ultimately, without sounding too dramatic in tax and exchange control matters, democracy will suffer.
I want to thank you so much for speaking to us this evening and clarifying a lot of very complicated issues and making the point really that it simply doesn't add up. You can't have no perfected transaction, which is what the Reserve Bank says, and then SARS finding that a $4 million sale was declared. So says Dr. Albertus Marais. He's an international tax expert and the founder of AJM Tax.